In the cold, thin air high above occupied Europe, the sky could appear deceptively calm. From the ground, the distant shapes of aircraft were nothing more than faint silhouettes drifting through pale clouds. But for the pilots who lived in that sky during the darkest years of World War II, every shape meant life or death. When German pilots of the Luftwaffe first encountered the massive American fighter known as the P-47 Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943, their reaction was not fear, it was laughter. The aircraft looked enormous compared to the sleek fighters they trusted. Its wide fuselage and thick wings gave it a bulky appearance, and from a distance it resembled a clumsy flying jug. German pilots joked about it in their mess halls, mocking what they believed was crude American engineering. Some even gave it a nickname that reflected their contempt: the flying milk bottle. To the experienced aces flying aircraft like the W190 and the BF-109, the P-47 Thunderbolt seemed like the wrong machine for the deadly dance of aerial combat. It looked too heavy, too slow to climb, and far too large to survive against fighters built for agility. But within months, the laughter began to fade, because hidden inside that bulky frame was something the Luftwaffe had completely misunderstood. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to fight their war. It was designed to change it. What the German pilots saw as weakness was actually a different philosophy of Combat 1, built around raw power, resilience, and an industrial approach to warfare that would soon reshape the skies of Europe. And by the time they finally realized their mistake, the P-47 Thunderbolt was already turning the air war of World War II in a direction they could no longer control. In early 1943, the air war over Europe had already become one of the most dangerous arenas of World War II. High above the battlefields, the skies were dominated by the experienced pilots of the German Luftwaffe. For years, they had fought across the continent, gaining skill through relentless combat. Their fighters, especially the Fu-190 and the Bf-109, were fast, agile, and deadly in the hands of seasoned aces. Against such opponents, survival demanded precision and speed. Air combat was often decided in seconds, with pilots relying on tight-turning maneuvers and lightning-fast reactions. In this environment, aircraft that lacked agility rarely lasted long. When the first American units in Britain began receiving the P-47 Thunderbolt, many of the pilots themselves shared the same doubts as their German adversaries. Several fighter groups had previously flown the elegant British Spitfire, a machine renowned for its graceful handling and tight turning ability. Compared to that thoroughbred fighter, the new American aircraft felt very different. The cockpit of the P-47 Thunderbolt was unusually spacious, and the aircraft itself felt heavy on the controls. On takeoff, it required long runways, something that could be a serious problem for forward bases in wartime Britain. Once airborne, the aircraft did not climb as quickly as many pilots hoped, and in turning dogfights, it struggled to match the nimble German fighters already dominating the skies. The aircraft's distinctive shape quickly earned it a nickname among American crews. Its large, rounded fuselage reminded many pilots of a household milk jug, and the name jug soon became common slang among fighter squadrons. At first, the nickname was not meant as a compliment. Behind this unconventional design stood a brilliant engineer named Alexander Kartveli. Rather than building a lightweight dogfighter, Kartveli approached the problem from a completely different angle. The United States Army Air Forces wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of protecting long-range bombers deep inside enemy territory. To accomplish that mission, Kartveli designed the aircraft around the most powerful engine available at the time, the massive Pratt and Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. This engine produced extraordinary power for its era, but it required a large airframe to house the equipment needed to operate efficiently at high altitudes. The result was an aircraft that looked enormous compared to the fighters of Europe. Empty, the P-47 Thunderbolt already weighed close to 5 tons. Fully loaded for combat, the aircraft could exceed 17,000 pounds. For comparison, many German fighters weighed barely half that amount. At first glance, the verdict seemed obvious. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a lumbering giant trying to compete in a world built for nimble predators. Early missions did little to improve its reputation. When the aircraft first entered combat operations in April 1943, technical problems and tactical confusion hampered its performance. During the first months of operations, P-47 units flew thousands of sorties, but achieved only limited success against German fighters. Meanwhile, losses began to mount. German pilots quickly realized that if they forced the heavy American aircraft into low-altitude turning engagements, the outcome often favored the lighter German machines. For many observers at the time, the conclusion seemed clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt appeared to be an impressive piece of engineering that simply did not belong in the brutal chess match of European air combat. But beneath that heavy exterior, the aircraft possessed a hidden strength that few people yet understood. The turning point for the P-47 Thunderbolt did not come from redesigning the aircraft. It came from understanding what the aircraft was truly built to do. At the center of that realization was the enormous Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. With more than 2,000 horsepower in its early versions, it was one of the most powerful piston engines of World War II. Later improvements would push that figure even higher. Compared to many German fighters, which typically produce between 1,400 and 1,800 horsepower, the P-47 Thunderbolt possessed a remarkable reserve of raw power. Yet the real secret of the aircraft was not simply the engine itself. It was the sophisticated turbo-supercharger system that allowed the engine to perform where many other fighters struggled. At high altitudes, the air becomes thin and oxygen levels drop dramatically, reducing engine performance. Most aircraft of the era use mechanical superchargers driven directly by the engine. While effective, these systems consumed valuable engine power and lost efficiency as altitude increased. The P-47 Thunderbolt approached the problem differently. Its turbo-supercharger used the aircraft's exhaust gases to spin a turbine, compressing incoming air and feeding it back into the engine. This clever system allowed the aircraft to maintain strong engine performance even at extreme altitudes. Above 25,000 feet, where the air grew cold and thin, many German fighters began to lose power. The P-47 Thunderbolt, however, was just beginning to perform at its best. In that environment, the heavy American aircraft suddenly became faster and more energetic than many of its opponents. But engine performance was only one part of the transformation. The Thunderbolt also carried a level of firepower rarely seen in a single-engine fighter. Mounted in its thick wings were 8 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. 4 on each side delivered a devastating stream of bullets whenever the pilot pressed the trigger. Together, those 8 guns could unleash more than 100 rounds per second. Pilots often describe the experience not as firing weapons, but as projecting a wall of metal toward the enemy aircraft. With thousands of rounds of ammunition on board, a Thunderbolt pilot could maintain sustained fire far longer than many opponents whose guns carried limited ammunition. Anything caught within that stream of fire faced catastrophic damage. Wings could be shredded, engines destroyed, and cockpits torn apart in seconds. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the P-47 Thunderbolt was its ability to survive punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The large radial engine was air-cooled, meaning it lacked the fragile coolant systems that made many liquid-cooled engines vulnerable to a single well-placed hit. Even when struck by enemy fire, the Thunderbolt often continued flying. One famous example occurred in June 1943, when American pilot Robert S. Johnson found himself under heavy attack by German fighters. His aircraft absorbed cannon fire and machine gun bursts that shattered parts of the fuselage and riddled the wings with holes. At one point, the aircraft appeared doomed. Yet somehow, the damaged P-47 Thunderbolt remained airborne. Johnson managed to guide the battered aircraft back across the English Channel and land safely. When mechanics examined the plane, they counted hundreds of bullet holes scattered across its frame. Stories like this began to circulate among Allied squadrons. Gradually, pilots who had once doubted the aircraft began to appreciate its strengths. The Thunderbolt was not built to win graceful turning battles. It was built to survive, strike hard, and dominate the high-altitude battlefield where the strategic bombing campaign of World War II would ultimately be decided. The P-47 Thunderbolt possessed immense power and firepower, but those strengths alone did not immediately guarantee success. During its early months in combat, many pilots still tried to fight the same kind of battles that German fighters had perfected for years. They attempted tight-turning engagements, chasing enemy aircraft in classic dogfights. In those situations, the heavy Thunderbolt was at a disadvantage. The breakthrough came when experienced commanders began to rethink how the aircraft should be used. Among them was the influential American fighter leader Hubert Zemke, who commanded the famed 56th Fighter Group. Zemke understood that the P-47 Thunderbolt should never attempt to match the agility of lighter fighters. Instead, its pilots needed to exploit the aircraft's greatest strengths: altitude, speed, and power. The solution became a combat method that would later be widely known as the boom and zoom tactic. Rather than engaging in prolonged turning battles, P-47 pilots climbed high above the combat zone, often reaching altitudes of 30,000 feet or more. From that vantage point, they scanned the skies below for enemy fighters approaching Allied bomber formations. Once a target appeared, the Thunderbolt pilots would tip their aircraft into a steep dive. In that moment, the heavy fighter transformed. What had once seemed like a weakness, its enormous weight suddenly became an advantage. Gravity pulled the aircraft downward with tremendous force, allowing it to accelerate rapidly as it plunged toward the enemy. During these dives, the P-47 Thunderbolt could reach extraordinary speeds, often exceeding 500 miles per hour. At such velocity, few aircraft of the era could safely pursue it without risking structural damage. The attack itself was brief but devastating. The Thunderbolt would streak toward its target, fire a concentrated burst from its 8 machine guns, and then continue past the enemy aircraft at tremendous speed. Before the opposing pilot could react effectively, the P-47 would already be climbing back toward altitude, preparing for another pass. This method avoided the slow, turning duels where German fighters excelled. Instead, it turned air combat into a series of rapid, high-speed strikes that favored the power and momentum of the Thunderbolt. As American pilots mastered this approach, the effectiveness of the P-47 Thunderbolt increased dramatically. The aircraft became one of the most reliable escorts for the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, protecting formations of B-17 and B-24 aircraft as they struck industrial targets deep inside occupied Europe and Germany. For German fighter pilots, the situation became increasingly dangerous. Before they could even reach the bomber formations, they often had to pass through layers of patrolling Thunderbolts, diving down from high altitude. The skies that had once seemed secure were becoming far more hostile. At the same time, improvements to the aircraft itself further enhanced its capabilities. Later versions of the P-47 introduced a bubble canopy that provided pilots with excellent visibility in every direction, eliminating the blind spots that had troubled earlier models. A new paddle blade propeller also improved the aircraft's acceleration and climbing performance. With these upgrades, the Thunderbolt became a far more balanced fighter. Its combination of speed, durability, and firepower made it a formidable opponent even for the experienced pilots of the Luftwaffe. Gradually, the laughter that had greeted the aircraft's arrival in 1943 disappeared. In its place came something far more serious: respect, and often fear, whenever German pilots saw the bulky silhouette of a P-47 Thunderbolt circling high above the battlefield. By early 1944, the air war over Europe was entering a new and decisive phase. Allied air forces had grown stronger, their bombing campaigns reaching deeper into German territory. At the same time, the balance of power in the skies was beginning to shift. The P-47 Thunderbolt had already proven itself as a powerful high-altitude escort fighter, but another aircraft was about to enter the stage. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang introduced a fighter with extraordinary range, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For many aircraft, such a development might have signaled the beginning of retirement from the front lines. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was far from finished. Instead, it found a new and devastating role that would make it even more feared by German forces on the ground. Thanks to its powerful engine and exceptionally strong airframe, the aircraft could carry a surprisingly heavy payload of bombs and rockets. In this new role as a fighter bomber, the Thunderbolt became one of the most destructive close support aircraft of World War II. Pilots began flying missions at extremely low altitude, sometimes only a few hundred feet above the ground. Their targets were not enemy fighters in the sky, but the lifelines of the German war machine below. Railroads, supply depots, armored columns, and troop convoys all became targets for roaming flights of Thunderbolts. Armed with bombs, rockets, and its 8 heavy machine guns, the P-47 Thunderbolt could strike with tremendous force. A convoy of trucks caught on an open road could be torn apart in seconds. A locomotive pulling vital supplies might be destroyed before its crew even realized what was happening. In the months leading up to the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, these attacks intensified. Allied planners understood that success on the beaches would depend heavily on crippling German logistics and slowing the movement of reinforcements. The Thunderbolt proved perfectly suited for this task, flying repeated strike missions across occupied France. P-47 squadrons systematically attacked rail lines, bridges, and supply routes. German commanders soon discovered that moving large formations during daylight hours had become extremely dangerous. For the soldiers on the ground, the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine became a warning signal. Whenever the sound echoed across the countryside, troops often rushed for cover, knowing that rockets, bombs, or machine gun fire might follow within seconds. German troops even developed a nickname for these relentless attacks. They called the aircraft Jabos, short for jag bomber or fighter bomber. The constant threat of sudden air attack produced a widespread sense of anxiety among many units, sometimes described by soldiers as a kind of Jabo fear. The damage inflicted by these missions was enormous. Thousands of railway cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, and transport trucks were destroyed during the final year of the war. Supply lines that once supported German armies across Western Europe were steadily weakened under the pressure of relentless airstrikes. In this way, the P-47 Thunderbolt helped transform Allied air superiority into a powerful weapon against the German military infrastructure itself. The aircraft that had once been mocked as clumsy was now playing a crucial role in dismantling the logistical backbone of Germany's war effort. By the time World War II came to an end in May 1945, the reputation of the P-47 Thunderbolt had changed completely. The aircraft that German pilots had once mocked as an awkward flying machine had become one of the most formidable fighters of the entire war. Its record spoke for itself. Over the course of the conflict, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew more than 500,000 combat missions. In air-to-air combat, it achieved an impressive kill-to-loss ratio of more than 4-1. Beyond the battles fought in the skies, its fighter-bomber missions devastated enemy supply lines across Western Europe. Thousands of trains, trucks, armored vehicles, and other targets were destroyed during its relentless attacks. In doing so, the Thunderbolt helped weaken the German military's ability to reinforce and resupply its forces during the critical final stages of the war. Yet the true story of the P-47 Thunderbolt goes beyond statistics or battlefield victories. It represents a deeper contrast between two very different approaches to warfare. The German Air Force had built its strategy around a relatively small number of highly skilled fighter aces. These experienced pilots were extremely dangerous opponents, but they were also difficult to replace. As the war dragged on and losses mounted, Germany struggled to train enough new pilots to maintain the same level of effectiveness. The United States followed a very different path. Instead of relying on a small elite force, American strategy emphasized large-scale production and a vast training system. Factories across the United States produced aircraft in extraordinary numbers, while thousands of new pilots were trained to fly them. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a perfect symbol of that philosophy. More than 15,000 of these fighters were built during the war. Their powerful engines, strong airframes, and heavy armament made them reliable tools of a military system designed for endurance and overwhelming force. In the end, the air war over Europe was not decided by a single battle or a single machine. It was shaped by technology, tactics, logistics, and industrial capacity working together on an immense scale. Even so, the Thunderbolt earned a unique place in that story. It began its combat career as an underestimated newcomer, ridiculed for its size, and questioned by the very pilots asked to fly it. Yet, through adaptation, improved tactics, and relentless use in battle, the P-47 Thunderbolt proved that strength sometimes lies where few expect it. The bulky fighter, once dismissed as a flying milk bottle, became a symbol of Allied air power and a key contributor to victory in Europe. And long after the war ended, its legacy continued to influence aircraft design. Decades later, another heavily armed aircraft, built to support troops on the ground, would inherit its name and spirit, the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt remains a powerful reminder of an enduring lesson from history. In war, the most underestimated weapon can sometimes become the one that changes everything.